So we'll try and get people back in line. Thanks again for bearing with us for what has really been an interesting discussion so far, and with the next guest really promises to get even better. So I have the great privilege of introducing our next featured speaker, Governor Tom Ridge. He has twice led the great state of Pennsylvania, was the first Secretary of Homeland Security following 9/11, and one of the largest reorganizations of the federal government involving more than 180,000 people, 22 federal agencies. So this is a person who understands the issues we're discussing intimately and at the highest levels of government and on a global stage. And we're so pleased as well that Governor Ridge is putting his considerable leadership in the risk and resilience space into the private sector with his firm, Ridge Global, and we have a few colleagues from Ridge Global here today who are really specializing in the whole domain of cyber resiliency, which is a top of mind concern for everyone. So with that, Governor Ridge, thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a very nice, lovely introduction. Thank you very much for your warm reception. I was a little worried that you were going to run down the list of jobs I've had in government, and your audience would turn and walk away saying, the guy can't hold a job, why should we listen to this guy? But nonetheless, you all still remain seated, so I'm grateful to have the opportunity to spend some time with you this morning. I've enjoyed my time in government. I was there a variety of jobs for almost 30 years. But now in the private sector, we have decided in my firm to focus on resiliency. And so I'll talk a little bit about resiliency in the cyber space, but it's really a mindset. And I know when they asked me to spend some time with you, they said, your title is Emerging Risks and Pathway to Resilience. And by the way, we've got a great panel scheduled after my remarks where we're going to cover a variety of different risks. But the mentality, I think, in terms of building within your enterprise, a nonprofit, law firm, corporation, whatever, that whole notion of resiliency endemic throughout the enterprise is what I'd like to talk to you a little bit about today. So with the notion of getting right to the subject, i.e. emerging risks and the pathway to resilience, let me say that in my judgment, the most effective pathway to resilience is you better manage your risk before they manage you. It's pretty straightforward. Easier said than done, though. In our limited experience in the companies we work with, it's been quite eye-opening in terms of those inside the enterprise and responsible for leading the enterprise accept the realities associated with doing business in the 21st century world. Now, it's been, let's see, it was October of 2001 when I became the assistant to the president. It was November of 2002 when I began. It's over 13 years since I became your Secretary of Homeland Security. And the universe of risk, not just in terrorism, but multiple risk tied into our interdependent world, it has multiplied dramatically since that time. And if you think about it, as individuals, as members of a family, as members of a community, members of a company, and as citizens, risk management is something we do every day and we probably don't even think about it. How many of you got a new car and didn't bother getting the insurance for a while, maybe put an addition onto your house, didn't bother getting more insurance? For you golfers in the room, how many of you are traveling down that, you're at that 17th tee, the lightning's brewing, you got a great round going on, the lightning's flashing all around you. I'll accept the risk. I'm going to finish this round. How many of you go to the mall? Oh, it's only a mile away. I'm not going to put the seatbelt on. So the notion that we accept a certain level of risk in our lives on a daily basis is something that I don't think we consider too much, but it's part of who we are. It's part of our country. And as much as I'd like to tell you that Homeland Security was the tip of the spear to identify the risk and crush it, we played defense. Our job was to manage the risk as we knew it in the event that something happened. I mean, clearly the message was, okay, can you identify the risk? Can you protect or defend against the risk? Are you prepared to deal with it? And if it happens, are you prepared to respond in recovery so you can keep on moving? That was the job. So I thought we'd set the scene for our panel to discuss the impacts and opportunities surrounding risk by talking about resiliency in the face of a risk-based world. Doing business in the 21st century, in my judgment, requires the organizations build a culture of resiliency. I don't know about you, but in biology class, I didn't care what was growing in those cultures, but it's a word that we throw around quite a bit. And I want to talk a little bit about the culture of an organization. And in that notion, it's the human element inside these organizations I think is absolutely essential. Culture is a popular word in organizations today. Depending on who you are, it's kind of how you define yourself. A lot of variations on the theme, I believe. Culture of innovation, culture of efficiency, culture of customer service, culture of values culture. Deming probably said it best way back in the 20th century, culture of continuous improvement. And frankly, those who built that culture into their organization ended up having a competitive advantage. And those who chose not to embed from the top down that notion of we have to be committed to improving process and quality every step of the way, every day, lost a competitive damage. So I think the 21st century, given the interdependency of the world, the multiplicity of risk, and the fact that there just seem to be more and more because of the interdependency in the world, I think there's value and an imperative of pursuing a culture of resiliency. Our interdependencies are greater than they've ever been. And frankly, if you're not resilient, circumstances and conditions can overwhelm you quickly. I don't know, man, if you had a chance to take a look at the Lloyd City Risk Index. I was fascinated when they took a look at the 301 cities, took about 18 different risks, and we're not even talking about black swans. Every risk that they identified is not unimaginable. They've happened. So you take those risks and see the conclusions they've drawn, and obviously you will conclude like they did. The impact, the economic impact, let alone the personal and human impact, is really substantial. I'm particularly interested because the nature of the business we do, looked at the cyber attacks in all 301 cities. We'd add up quickly. That's why you should probably hire us. $4.56 trillion. Fascinating. New York, 14 billion of GDP, London almost 8, Sydney almost 5, DC. I mean, the list goes on and on. Just associated with cyber. And obviously there's even greater risk attendant to what Mother Nature can do for us. So the threat of a cyber attack to critical infrastructure is a serious one, and it escalates every day. And I think we have to not be breathless about it. We have to accept that notion. Like the folks at Homeland Security, I was privileged to work with an extraordinary group, particularly those who volunteered to come in the first couple months. I mean, who the heck knew what was going to happen? But they knew their job was to try to prevent an attack, and if one occurred, to be able to respond and recover as quickly as possible. But they knew that resiliency did not mean you could build a fail-safe system, because you can't. Resiliency doesn't mean you avoid risk, because you can't. As much as in the ideal world you'd like to think you could. It means that you have to think about preventing it, understanding you can't develop the fail-safe system. You have to think about mitigating it. You have to think about how you can survive it, and then you have to think simultaneously, if you survive, how you continue to operate the enterprise for which you are responsible. The impact of a cyber incursion is real, it's painful, it's costly, but resilient enterprises survive and move on. Now, you heard me say this a couple minutes ago, but I think organizational leadership is absolutely critical. It is the pathway to resiliency. You have to manage that risk before it manages you. And think about this for a moment, trying to list, and Lloyd did it for us, but you start with Hurricane Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, a large terrorist attack like 9/11. Our economy remains a target from the digital world, be they nation states, terrorists, hacktivists, organized crime. Obviously, we continue to be vulnerable to weather events. The list seems to be endless. And so you have these physical threats and cyber attacks. Frankly, you should know this. When we used to red cell internally, if you put together a digital attack and a physical attack from cyber, you really have a major, major problem. So you have to think in those terms, and we did. The one thing I would say about the risks that we will talk about in the panel and the digital risk, and I know we're in a law firm, a beautiful law firm. Anybody here from this beautiful law firm? I'd like to, nobody here from the firm, good. I was going to throw a couple bones your way, maybe, but anyhow, it's a fabulous place, right? This is a gorgeous, gorgeous place. I've never seen anything quite like it. But I'm an attorney by profession, long time ago. I'd love, if I were a young man or woman going to the legal profession, and I was smart enough to have either a computer science background or an engineering background, I'd focus on digital law, because there's going to be an explosion of litigation in that space, just like in the 70s and 80s and 90s, it was environmental law. And if nothing else, you better build a narrative if you're running a company, publicly or privately, shareholders or just private investors, that you did everything you can to manage that risk. And I just don't see, and I still think I could do a pretty good cross-examination, I don't think you can plead surprise as a defense. The whole notion that, we were surprised the nature and the severity of the attack. And I guess in cross-examination, you'd probably say to you, well, where were you when they hit Home Depot? Target, Sony, Anthem, OPM? Surprise is no longer defense. And so I think you need to be prepared at every organization. By the way, I was in China a couple weeks ago and talking to some very interesting officials, some retired from the government, some involved in the government. And just as an aside, I didn't have the courage to ask for my OPM records back. I think you ought to know that. They got them. They know more about me than my wife does, because she doesn't have my fingerprints and some of the other stuff. I mean, that's just the way it is. Just so you know, whenever we talk about cyber espionage, or they throw Snowden in our face. So we don't think that impact of Snowden is somehow evaporated into the air when we're trying to have serious discussions, not only about national espionage, but economic espionage, theft of IP and things of that sort. So we can't plead surprise. And frankly, after Ebola and Zika, you can't exactly say, well, Mother Nature snuck up on me. And after Katrina and Sandy, you can't say Mother Nature surprised me. Those are the risks. And that's what we're here to talk about. And I think leaders have to be prepared at every level of the organization. And we've done some tabletop exercises. And I really compliment the enterprises that are willing to put their CEO next to their CFO, next to their general counsel, next to their division heads, next to their communication people. You get all the C-suite there, and then you talk about a couple of physical attacks, and maybe a weather event, and then a cyber attack, all occurring in a period of time, and see how prepared they are internally to deal with legitimate, foreseeable threats to the enterprise. Fortunately, most of the ones that we've dealt with are prepared, but no matter how prepared they were, we think we gave them some suggestions how they could be even better prepared. For an organization to be truly resilient, we think the mindset and the philosophy has to begin at the C-suite. We think that the questions that you have to ask in the organization have to come down from the C-suite and the board of directors. And I think cyber attacks, frankly, illuminate the peril of operating in the 21st century. Remember, it starts at the top. Everyone has a role to play, from the boardroom to the loading dock. Resiliency is an investment. It is not an expense. Good risk management is preemptive. In the long run, return on risk resiliency is high. I know a very cross-section of individuals in this room representing a cross-section of our economy, but whether you're in the insurance business or you're in the corporate world, you don't have to answer these questions out loud, but I'm going to ask you a few to See whether you ask your clients or whether your C-suite's paying attention to them. Does your organization have a strategic security plan in place that identifies and addresses risks? It was interesting, during one of the incredible storms down in Florida after I became secretary. Remember, FEMA was under Homeland Security. Now, you're in the hurricane zone, right? It should not be a surprise that you're going to hit along the coast with a hurricane. It was absolutely fascinating to me to find out that there was a small regional bank that had anticipated it, had generators ready. Actually, when nobody could get out of their homes, they were actually open for business within 24 hours. They anticipated the risk associated with not necessarily doing business, but their brand. Hey, we took the hit. Our doors are open. And a couple of the big banks closed the doors for several days before they become operational. Here's the mindset from the CEO on down. This is a risk. It's not a black swan event. We're in this space. Are we prepared to deal with it in a meaningful and a responsive way? Does your security plan that addresses risks to your assets? How about assets in transit? How about human capital? I've often wondered if Mother Nature threw a pathogen at us that was contagious, and all of a sudden, a significant portion of your workforce didn't appear. Are you ready to deal with that? How about your brand equity? It's pretty important. What about your intellectual property? We've dealt with some companies on the cyber side, and we have asked them to set aside what we call, everybody uses the term, what are your crown jewels? Do you limit the access to that IP? And by the way, when it comes to access, how do you validate it? You're still using passwords, your mother's maiden name, that kind of stuff? Have you really brought it in the 21st century? Does your organization employ a systematic method to measure, monitor, and manage security on a sustained basis? You could be pretty well protected today against the digital. You got your digital profile. I'm feeling pretty good. How often do you go back and check it? It's a dynamic environment. You better check it more than once a year. Does your organization have an established corporate structure that supports all security functions? We had occasion to be talking to a publicly traded company, and we were talking to their operational people here and their IT people here. And we said, as you build out your cyber resiliency program, are you in communication? Do you talk with one another? And the operational people said, well, why would we want to do that? And we said, because you have SCADA systems operationally, and you better have it connected to your IT because you got some critical infrastructure that's very vulnerable, so you ought to be connecting. We talked to a larger company, a multinational company, dealing in the, well, I can't tell you what it was. It was amazing. They're a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, and their HR, and their finance, and their digital, and their every other vertical. There was not an enterprise-wide digital team to make sure that connectivity not only existed, but it was directed in a way that maximized security for those portions of the enterprise they considered to be the crown jewels. Does your organization have a compliance program for all legal and regulatory security requirements that are relevant? SOX, Foreign Corrupt Practices, HIPAA, PCI, and those of you in the cyber world know that the proliferation and the emerging proliferation of regulations on a state-by-state basis is going to complicate the world not only of your digital team, but of legal counsel as well. Does your organization have in place a process to identify, verify, and validate the security protocols with your vendors, with key partners to your enterprise? I got a long list of questions. I'm not going to bother going over anymore other than if you're a publicly traded company, how connected are your digital people to your board of directors? And to whom does the CISO report? There was a survey done by, I forget the name of the company that did the survey, but they put about 1,000 IT professionals in a room, critical to the digital security, the digital resiliency of the company. 78% of them said they had never briefed the board. It's not a technical problem, folks. It's a business imperative. And I don't pretend to design a website for it. I can't do anything about O's and ones, but O's and ones do translate to the bottom line, the financial side. They are interconnected. A couple final thoughts. I don't want to take any more time because I think it's a very interesting panel. The journey or the path to building a resilient enterprise in today's world it's not a smooth one. Frankly, it's a journey that will never end. In the cyberspace, if you think about 2020 when 50 billion devices are hooked up to the internet, that exposure and that vulnerability gets greater and greater every day. Frankly, ladies and gentlemen, the digital sun's never getting set. It's just going to get hotter. And I think we need to understand that. Nobody needs to be breathless about it. You just accept the reality as it is. You make those commitments inside your organization. Lloyd will be the first one to tell you, I'm going to tell you too, if you're going to manage any kind of risk, one of the means by which you reduce or mitigate that risk is insurance. I mean, that's just part of a risk management strategy. That is what it is. We know threats are going to continue to evolve, a lot more complex. Used to be that the hackers would use the same piece of malware or code and throw it out to multiple enterprises and see if they could penetrate the system. We're seeing now more and more with the sophistication of the hackers, organized crime, in some countries that look the other way or maybe even finance it. The malware is strategic. It may take months to design it, maybe with just one company or one piece of IP they're particularly interested in. So the range of threats get greater. The complications get greater. That's the world. You just accept it and build a culture of resiliency to respond and recover. I was never a very good student in biology. I did read part of Darwin's Origin of the Species. And one of the interesting observations I learned early on is that everybody looks to his trip out to the Galapagos Islands. How many have been there? They tell me it's ought to be on your bucket list. Have you been there? Yeah, it's fabulous, right? That's what they tell me. Did you write a book after you wrote that? Okay, I'm just curious. Maybe Darwin 2.0, I don't know. But the fascinating thing about this book and his research, and I think somewhat it's misinterpreted. People are quick to conclude, and I guess I was one of them until I better understood what he said, is he didn't really talk about the survival. When he talked about the survival of the fittest, he wasn't talking about the biggest or the strongest or the most powerful. He said the species that survives and flourishes is a species that adapts to change. So in the 21st century, the change to which I think we all must adapt, personally, corporately, as a country, is that the risks are greater. There are very few black swan. We know we're going to talk about all the ones that the country and individuals are going to face. You accept the risk, accept they're going to get a little more complex, a little bit more burdensome, a little more troublesome, and you manage it. And I think the organizations and the countries that accept that, develop that culture of resiliency, their willingness to adapt to the 21st century, will not only survive, but I happen to think they'll have a competitive advantage in the marketplace. So it's been a great pleasure to share these thoughts with you, and I look forward to participating with my colleagues on the panel. Thank you very much.